we can sometimes be big talkers when it comes to like engaging communities, but do you invite your community members over for dinner? Do you have your community members' phone numbers, right? And at a certain point, they stop becoming community members and they start becoming your neighbors.
I'm Delia Colon, and this is The Zest. Citrus, seafood, Spanish flavor, and Southern charm. The Zest celebrates cuisine and community in the Sunshine State. Today, ensuring healthy, sustainable, and culturally appropriate foods for all. Today, we're exploring a concept that's important for all of us to understand. Food sovereignty. Now, if you're fuzzy on what the term means, don't worry. Here to break it all down is Professor William Schanbacher, PhD. He teaches religious studies at the University of South Florida, and he directs USF's Food Sovereignty Initiative. Professor Schanbacher walked over from his office on the USF campus to our studio at WUSF to chat with me. He starts by explaining what exactly food sovereignty means.
The formal definition is food sovereignty is the human right to food and the right for people to produce their own healthy and sustainable food, but it's also related to the cultural foods that we want to eat. And on top of that, growing food in ecologically sound and sustainable ways. So there's this focus on the environment too. So we have the human right to food, we have growing food in an environmentally and ecologically sustainable way. But food sovereignty really puts the needs and the aspirations of local farmers and food producers at the center of our food system. So too often we forget where our food comes from. So we really want to kind of focus on those food producers, but also producing local food for local consumption first, rather than kind of growing for global communities or export markets. Food sovereignty emerged in Central and South America in landless peasant communities. And it's just now kind of growing into sort of northern urban context. So obviously landless people don't exist in the same way here as they might in, some of these other countries around the world. So food sovereignty here still adheres to some of those same principles, the localization of food, still growing food in ecological ways, focusing on food producers, but we have to understand the sort of geographical, cultural, and economic contexts here in the United States as well. So it's going to take a slightly different shape than what it might if we were looking at a Guatemala or Brazil or something like that.
Okay, very cool. How did you get into this with your background in religious studies?
Yeah, it really started back when I was writing my PhD dissertation, and I was focused more on kind of the ethics of global religions and sort of, those big questions that we have, the meaning of life kind of thing. But I really was captured by sort of human suffering on a broad scale and specifically global poverty. And when I dove into that, I saw hunger and malnutrition as one of those especially poignant forms of human suffering. And when I dove into sort of the global food system, I saw how crazy it was. And so it was that roundabout way where I started with the global scene that I eventually started to say, wait a second, when I look at world religions, and we're talking about everything, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, there is this theme, one of food. Food is always present in the stories and in the narratives, but there's a larger ethical theme of taking care of the poor, taking care of those who are hungry, taking care of those who are in need. And I was like, well, this is kind of a unifying thing. As much as religion can be a divisive topic, and it has been, we have to be honest about that in world history, there are certain themes in there that can really apply to this topic of food and the ethics of food. So I started to see some connections there. So that's how it kind of crossed paths for me.
I love that because some people think of sovereignty as God gave us the planet to do whatever we want with. I don't need to recycle. I can eat whatever I want.
Absolutely.
I'm the king of the castle. I'm the queen of the castle.
Yeah.
And this is saying, no, we are caretakers of this land and we have to make sure that everybody's taken care of.
Right.
I love that. Okay. So you said that the food system is crazy. And from what I've, the little bit that I've learned about it hosting this podcast, I can attest to that. What's something that people might be surprised to know? Yeah,
so for lack of a better word, I think if we were to kind of dig a little bit deeper, it's crazy, but it's crazy because it's broken. So it's a little more serious than just calling it crazy, right? And I think we really saw that with the COVID-19 pandemic and when our supply chains were shutting down, when our restaurants were closing. Here just in locally, there was the demand for seeds, there was the demand for fresh produce and stuff like that because we just saw how dependent we were on regular foods that we just take for granted. COVID-19 specifically revealed kind of the fragility of the global food system and how we are so dependent on products that are coming from other parts of the world. You know, it's crazy. Here in Florida, we can grow food year round. And so the fact that we were struggling all of a sudden finding food, there wasn't food on the shelves, or we're resorting to canned foods when we can just grow food in our backyards, really opened a lot of people's eyes to that.
Yeah, and you're right. That is wild, because you go to the grocery store or even some of these farmers markets, which are kind of like glorified Walmarts. If you look at, the garlic is from China and the limes are from Mexico. And it's like, wait, can't we grow those things here?
Right.
And I've noticed, I don't know if you've noticed, whenever there's a natural disaster, a hurricane or anything else disruptive, fresh produce is like the first thing to go. Yeah. Bananas, you can't find them.
Right.
In the grocery store.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really an example I give when I teach my classes too. Sometimes I'll tell students, where does your food come from? And you know, we struggle through it, and people say things like, I don't know, I'm not sure. And the avocados, some of the citrus, the tomatoes are good examples that I tell my students, next time you're at the grocery store, go and pick up one of those things and look at that little sticker and tell me where the avocado comes from. And usually there'll be one or two students that say something like, oh, yeah, it's from Mexico or it's from California. And then I show them a map and I say, even food that we produce here in the United States is largely from the Central Valley in California, and we're shipping it thousands of miles, when here in Florida we can grow that food. So that's really where food sovereignty comes into play in terms of what I mentioned about the localization of food. We have the ability to grow food and it not to have to travel hundreds or thousands of miles. And reconsidering the way that we structure those supply chains, for example, really can be a benefit to everybody, right? I mean, it can benefit not only the environment because the food's not traveling as far, it can benefit our local farmers who are no longer having to compete with global markets or with faraway places like California that can mass produce food as well. So in some ways, it really is something that could benefit all.
And it tastes better.
And it tastes so much better.
That part.
Yeah.
Okay, so when and why did you start the Food Sovereignty Initiative here at USF? We're recording this at WUSF Studios on the USF campus.
Yeah, so I would say it's really kind of a proto version of it has been around since I got here in 2011. My colleague Del Deschamps, who's now retired, lives up in Newport Richey, another great area where you can see food sovereignty happening on a day-to-day basis, really started thinking about how we could start to implement these ideas into our courses that we teach. And so we've been kind of talking about that over the years. I would say really, though, in 2019 was when it really took off. And that's when we started to formalize, kind of created a board, and we had our first annual summit. So since then, we've had a summit each year, which is a great event for the community to come and get involved and see kind of what food sovereignty is all about. But really, that is the moment in which we realized to solve this problem of food insecurity, which is also a core kind of goal of food sovereignty, we need a multifaceted, multi-tiered, and in terms of USF here, a multidisciplinary approach to things, right? It's no longer, one area of expertise. Some people will call this a wicked problem, food insecurity, right? Because it's in some ways unsolvable. But and this is really a key for us, is if we can bring different minds together from different fields. So we have people that are involved in the initiative, in the Food Sovereignty Initiative, from the College of Public Health, from the departments of sociology and communication, so storytelling, how societies work. My Department of Religious Studies asks some of those big questions, right? But even new groups like SIGS, our School of Interdisciplinary Studies, the Muma College of Business is also, teamed up with us in some areas. So we're really exploring how, if we look at a problem from multiple different angles, right, we're going to be able to come up with solutions and creative ideas that maybe not one discipline could come up with. So that's really sort of the structure and the organization of the initiative itself. And just to kind of give you an example of that, we have 3 different areas of focus. We focus on research, right? As a research university, this is a primary focus of what we do here at USF. So we can look at food insecurity, we can look at community food programs from sort of a research angle. But then really, we also like to try to engage with the community as much. So we have our second arm, which is community engagement. So I mentioned the Food Sovereignty Summit being one event that we have each year, but I work a lot with local community gardens, local food initiatives. And so whether it's teaming up students with those groups, either to volunteer or to get guest presentations, at community gardens, there's various ways in which we, work with the community. And then lastly, curriculum. So developing courses. Last year we won a National Endowment for the Humanities planning grant, in which we had over 20 courses from many different disciplines. I believe there was 6 or 7 different disciplines that all came together, and the faculty teaching courses related to food took that time, that grant period, to develop a food sovereignty component into their classes. So now we have food sovereignty in sociology courses, communication courses, world languages courses, public health courses. So it's small, but it's just sort of living out that idea that these ideas are not specific to one area. We can talk about food insecurity, food sovereignty, creating healthier food systems from a variety of different perspectives. All students across all their majors and minors can learn about this topic in important ways.
Yeah, food touches everything.
It does.
Is that why you think a college campus makes a good home base for this initiative?
Yes, absolutely. And that's been one of the exciting things about the initiative is we can do kind of everything, right? We have access to great research opportunities, whether it's through, the helpful faculty here working on grants to other internal support systems. So there really is that strong support from USF to kind of think about these big problems. But we also live in a diverse community that, frankly, has suffered the brunt of food insecurity in many ways. And this might be a topic worth talking about, too, because there is an element of food injustice that is involved with food sovereignty. So being able to work with diverse communities here in Tampa, but also very food insecure communities as well, makes it an opportune way, or I guess an opportunity to work with the very communities that suffer from food insecurity in the first place. So we have the community component, we have the research component, and then we have, this student population that is excited to learn about this stuff. So
you said food injustice. What is that?
Oftentimes when we think about injustice, we don't necessarily connect it to food. And so when I think about food injustice, we ask ourselves, okay, why do we have, globally speaking, upwards of 750 million to 1 billion people who suffer from food insecurity each year? At the same time, we have almost the exact amount of people, globally speaking, that suffer from obesity. So now we have, a global population of 7 million. We've got almost 1 billion that are food insecure, almost 1 billion that are overweight. Right? How do we have or suffer from health problems due to this? Why is that the case? This is not by accident, right? I mean, we have certain laws, we have policies, we have institutions that are in place that have directed how food is distributed. We have directed how food is grown, who's able to grow food, what farmers are supported for growing food, what farmers are not supported for growing food. So, I mean, we could spend an entire day talking about these issues, but I think that's when we think about injustice, we think about the ways in which society and our culture has been organized in a way that has disenfranchised certain groups, that has ensured that certain groups remain food insecure while others do not. So there's a lot of questions you can explore with respect to that justice question.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but growing up, my parents would say things like, there are children starving in Africa, so you need to finish your green beans. And I'm like, my eating these green beans is not going to help. If I could somehow get these green beans to them, we would all be winning, right?
Yes.
So it's a little bit frustrating because, we've got so much food waste here in certain sectors of the United States. And then in the United States and abroad, we have people who are food insecure.
Yeah. And that really touches on kind of a last point of food sovereignty as well. Food sovereignty really is about the entire food cycle, from production to distribution to consumption, and then, as you mentioned at the end, food waste or disposal. There are estimates between 17 to 30% of all food, globally speaking, is wasted. Whether it's wasted, at the farm when we're kind of harvesting things because of industrialized agriculture. So the use of big machinery is going to necessarily waste food just because of the inefficiencies. There are efficiencies, but there's inefficiencies too. On transport to grocery stores, there's food that is wasted. When we go to our grocery stores, right, we see, and I'm guilty of this myself. You pick through those tomatoes or you pick through those vegetables because you want one that looks nice, right? And in reality, they're all the same, right? Sometimes those vegetables that don't look the best are the ones that taste the best because they're the ones that are not artificially processed or sprayed with materials to keep them looking a certain color throughout the entire distribution process. So those are kind of just a few examples of the ways in which we waste food, because that food that's not purchased at the grocery store eventually ends up getting thrown out. And in many ways, it's just because we don't like the looks of it. Right?
Or we buy too much. Or we think, new year, new me, I'm going to eat all the kale.
Yeah.
And then it ends up in, friend of the pod, Wendy Wesley, has called it the drawer of death. when you put the vegetables in there, it's like, no, I'm ordering takeout tonight. So that's another form of waste.
Absolutely.
Earlier, you talked about receiving a grant, and I wanted to ask you about another grant that you all received. It was the USDA Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production Grant, and you used that money to create the Food Sovereignty Toolkit. What does this kit contain, and how can communities use it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a real exciting project, and it was with the Food Sovereignty Initiative, but the primary investigator, as we call her, the lead on it was Well-Fed Community, another really fantastic community here in the local area. Dalia Bumbaca and Christiane Burros are two of the people that worked on the project with us as the leaders. And what we did during that project is we put together a team to work with community members. So we're up here at the university area community up by USF, and then another area kind of in the Ybor sector of town. And what we did is we wanted to work with community members to see what their experience with food insecurity was like, right? And so really kind of begin with community members, their stories and their experience. And then from there, see, one, what they knew about this idea of food sovereignty, and two, whether or not we could kind of come up with programs in ways in which, we could start to solve, concrete action towards solving food insecurity. And one of the great experiences, and we had many, kind of ups and downs throughout the process, was really this has to begin with kind of understanding the stories of community members. So one of the things that we did is we ended up having these community meals. So Well-Fed Community provided the food. A lot of that food was reclaimed food that we would then make, great recipes that Well-Fed Community made on their own, right? And we really wanted to focus in on that idea of human dignity that is at the center of food sovereignty. So when I talked about food being a human right, it's not just a human right, it's the right to kind of culturally important and dignified food. So that's kind of the central pillar that guided much of our programs that we ran during that grant period. So we said, why don't we make these community meals not just kind of handing out food, right? We get that with many of the food banks and the food distribution things. Instead, let's make it different. This is about coming together as community members, coming together as family, really. And when we come together as families, what do? We sit around a dinner table. We bring out the dishes. We bring out the plates that we eat with our family members. So we did that, and we would put the tablecloths, and we would decorate with flowers, and we would put actual plates with glassware and silverware, right? Because we're trying to build community. We're trying to build family. It's not just hearing about stories and doing research. It's really actually about building a community together. And so that was a small way in which we brought that food sovereignty idea of human dignity to the event. Now, I kind of digress into that story. That's just sort of on the research end, how we decided to gather data, right? Instead of like filling out surveys or handing out questionnaires to people, we just sat around and talked and listened to stories. We had graduate teaching assistants who were wonderful in the project that jotted notes down. We were able to come up with certain principles that kind of aligned themselves with food sovereignty. So you'll find that in the toolkit. Things like recognize this idea of universal dignity, promote reciprocal relationships in your communities that you work with, build social capital. That's an academic term, but it's the idea of building networks and connections with one another and with community members. Celebrate culture. Right. So when we talk about, that this word culture is thrown around a lot and cultural diversity is thrown around a lot, but instead let's just make it simple. Let's celebrate, let's get excited and learn about different cultures, right? Yes. And learn about it through food.
Yes.
And it's as easy as that. We don't have to make it political. We don't have to make it controversial. We just want to know. Tampa's such a wonderful community of different diverse cultures. And what better way to explore culture than through food and listening to people's stories about food? So we really did that during those community meals. And then this one might sound a little more kind of hard-nosed, but command collaboration, right? So collaboration is a key word, but we often think about like in this more flowery sort of like, it's great to collaborate. But for these things to work, for us to really kind of tackle this issue of food insecurity, we can't do it alone, right? And too many times we have organizations that are all doing the same thing. I'm guilty of it too. We kind of get in our own silos, we get in our own headsets, but we have to force ourselves. That's where we kind of, we delicately chose this word, command collaboration. We tell people, like, if you really are serious about this, you're going to have to go through the growing pains of working with people you might not necessarily agree with, working with people you might not necessarily like, you might not have the same political sort of allegiances, but you've got to collaborate towards that common goal of solving food insecurity and creating a more sustainable food system. But then now kind of stepping back a little bit, you also need to be adaptable too, right? I mean, we learn that, okay, not everything's going to go the right way. We're not going to get along with everybody. So be able to, be flexible and adaptable. And lastly, and I think you might appreciate this, tell stories.
Yes.
Just encourage people to tell stories, because that's the best way. I mean, I'm a firm believer. I know we need to gather data as a researcher. This is important. But just try to imagine ways, if you're trying to build a food sovereignty sort of initiative in your own community, to do it through storytelling. So that's great. So it's really self-guided to a certain extent, right? It's not imposing any sort of model on people, but simply saying, here's an idea of how you can take the core principles of food sovereignty. Here's some measurable outcomes that you can kind of check off for yourself that can give your organization kind of an idea of how aligned you are with food sovereignty, and some areas where you might be able to improve on things. So that's where this toolkit really comes into play, and anybody can use it.
I love the flexibility of it.
Yeah.
Because when people have had success in a certain arena, a lot of times they think they can solve everyone's problems, and it doesn't always work that way. So that's great. If you had a magic wand, what would you change tomorrow?
Oh, goodness. I think if I were to really be sincere with the concept of food sovereignty, I would kind of unveil, I guess, sort of how the food system is controlled by big corporations, how unfair it is to local farmers, how historical processes have led to communities of color, for example, being food insecure in such a way that would not necessarily impose a solution, but would really show people, oh, wait a second, right? It doesn't have to be this way. And it would allow for people to kind of make their own decisions. One of the things I learned early on in looking at food sovereignty is I had these ideals of creating this world of harmony. I was very idealistic, and I still am to a certain degree. But bottom line, food sovereignty respects the right of cultures and local communities. So that means that if their idea of the good life, if their idea of a healthy and sustainable society doesn't look like mine, then that's okay. We have to be willing to accept what type of communities people want to create. But I truly, and this is where my idealistic side comes in, I believe that through education and kind of showing people the true dynamics of the food system itself, that people will see, wait, a better world is possible.
Ooh, that's so good.
And that's what I want to live in.
Thank you for that. That's beautiful. And I know I put you on the spot, but I think you're right. Once you see something, you can't unsee it. You're someone who has sort of seen behind the curtain. Is there something you do differently than perhaps the rest of us now that you know what's really going on with our food system?
I think in my life, so kind of coming back to that question of justice, I think to really truly see things, right? See the experience of people that live in food insecurity that are struggling with these things, you have to have proximity to the problem. So we talk about developing collaborations, right? But what does that really mean? We can sometimes be big talkers when it comes to like engaging communities, but do you invite your community members over for dinner? Do you suffer with and are you there when communities go through loss? Do you have your community members' phone numbers, right? And at a certain point, they stop becoming community members and they start becoming your neighbors. And for me, that's what I've tried to do. I live, in East Tampa. I live just 3 blocks away from this great initiative called the Healthy 22nd Street Initiative, where we have community gardens, we have demonstration gardens, where the people in that community do experience food insecurity, right? So I'm not saying I'm special in that sense, but by living and being neighbors with people, that gives you a more intimate kind of understanding of all of these issues. So that's something that I think is really essential.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's one thing to write a check, but it's another thing to interact with people on a daily basis, have meals with them, have their phone number. I love that. Yeah. That's so good. Okay, so we've talked about some of your roles. You are also the faculty sponsor of the USF Agrarian Club, which I did not know was a thing. What does it do? And I can't believe that in the 21st century, so many young adults are interested in joining an agrarian club.
Yeah, that's been a really cool experience too. We've had the club since I want to say 2014, but really for the first 4 or 5 years, it was a small club. I would say anywhere between 10 to 15 members. And it was great. We had the botanical gardens here at USF, had some areas where students could grow. But really, after COVID, it kind of took off. And now there are I was looking last night, over 280 members. Yeah. So it has really exploded to the point where just last year, the botanical gardens here at USF actually revamped the entire space. And we now have 75 garden beds. I think we had maybe a handful before, but the popularity, and it's not just the agrarian club. There's other courses, the courses that I teach, but across disciplines, people are teaching courses now that are integrating gardening and growing of food into their courses. So the agrarian club itself is undergraduate and graduate students, but they grow food in the botanical gardens. They learn about Florida, native vegetables and things, like that. As it's grown, they invite guest speakers to come in. So they learn about things like vermiposting, worm farming, right? So growing worms to create healthy soil. They just started last year the very first food sovereignty farmers market. So This is really cool, right? So I'm really excited
Where
about that
one
because
go.
It's at the botanical gardens. But the agrarian club really kind of embraced this concept of food sovereignty. And they said, not only do we want to do this, let's live it out. Let's see if we can actually create a farmer's market that focuses on these things. So we're gonna vet the vendors to ensure that, like you mentioned at the beginning, sometimes these farmers markets, they're great, but we're getting food from all over the country, all over the world, really. But if we're going to adhere to food sovereignty, let's see if we can bring together vendors and people that are really producing locally grown foods and products. So that's been really exciting. So they're really doing a bunch of different things. Yeah.
That's so cool. What do you think's going on there? Why are so many young people interested in this?
Yeah, I think part of it is due to COVID, and they kind of grew up in that generation where they saw how fragile our food system is, and they were really wanting to learn how to do something on their own. If we ever experience something like that again, am I prepared to grow my own food? So I think that's part of it. I think students are recognizing that food is not as healthy as they would like it to be, right? So they're really trying to kind of improve their health and say, you know what, I need to eat better foods. Fast food is not cutting it. I don't feel good. I can't concentrate. My studies aren't as good. And they're starting to learn that actually when you eat better, you're able to concentrate better. You're able to, get through the day. And then lastly, I think food insecurity on college campuses is a real issue, right? I mean, some estimates up to 25% of college students are food insecure. So that is something that I think, whether it's intentional or not, students are also kind of saying, hey, this is an opportunity for me to kind of grow some extra food too. So that's kind of the sad side of things too. But for all those reasons, I think, this is why we've seen an expressed or renewed interest in it.
Wow. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for coming in.
Absolutely. Thank you.
William Schanbacher, PhD, is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of South Florida and Director of the USF Food Sovereignty Initiative. If you want to learn more or get involved, you can check out the link in the show notes or on our website, thezestpodcast.com. It'll take you to the USF Food Sovereignty Initiative page for all the info. I'm Dalia Colon. I produce The Zest with Andrew Lucas and Alexandria Ebron. The Zest is a production of WUSF, copyright 2025, part of the NPR network.